Hello and welcome to the Koali webinar this month. My name is Jessica Eyre. I'm the Director of Content here at Koali. I am so glad you could join us today. All attendees on this webinar will be on mute throughout the presentation. We have some exciting topics to discuss today, and we will get through as many questions as we can in the time that we have. This webinar will be recorded and a link to that recording will be sent to you, and you can feel free to share that with colleagues who couldn't make it today. So before we dive into the discussion, let me take a minute to introduce our panelists. Today we have Aaron Cannon. He has been developing software for over 20 years and has specialized in accessibility for over 10. He was previously the lead software accessibility engineer at Instructure, a company which is best known for its learning management platform, Canvas. He is now the Chief Accessibility Engineer and co-founder of Accessible 360, a company which specializes in helping businesses and organizations make their websites and mobile applications accessible. Recently, he has also had the opportunity to provide consulting and expert witness services for companies impacted by the recent rise in accessibility lawsuits and settlement demand letters. Finally, Aaron is himself totally blind and has been a screen reader user for the past 30 years. We also have Ryan Lewis. Ryan is the Curriculum and Catalog Management Engineer Manager at Koali. He has been in the software industry for the past 10 years, working at other companies like Expedia and T-Mobile. In addition to developing software, he has also taught others to code at the University of Washington, Seattle Central College, and online with Pluralsight and LinkedIn Learning. So thank you, panelists, for being with us today. I'm really looking forward to your insights and everything that you have to offer. So we're going to jump into the questions. What I'd like to start out with is kind of more of a general one, and what is accessibility and what types of things do those involve?
I can take that one if you'd like.
Go for it.
Great. So really, when I think about accessibility, I think about what is the end goal. And really the end goal is to ensure, to build your technology, your website, your mobile application, and I suppose also, of course, there's also the physical space you're building and so forth, but specifically talking about digital accessibility, it's really ensuring that as many people with disabilities are able to utilize your technology, your app, your content, your website. So it's really about giving access to as many different folks as possible, regardless of their abilities or disabilities.
Perfect. Can you talk a little bit about, I think, we mentioned in your bio the e-readers. Can you talk, maybe just give kind of a few other examples of some of those, some things that provide different types of accessibility digitally?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's see. I can probably the easiest way is just to give you a demonstration. So I have my phone here, and it has software on it. This is a standard iPhone. Sorry, the screen's probably really dirty. I never noticed, but doesn't keep me from using it. But anyway, I didn't realize I was going to be doing a demo on my phone. But let me turn it on, and you can hear. So basically, you can hear that my phone is essentially talking to me, and this is just one aspect of accessibility. There are many features available on the iPhone. This is built right in. So this is VoiceOver that you hear in the background. So I'm basically just going through my home screen as I swipe on the screen. So this is just one example of the types of functionality that a person with disability would use on their mobile device. There's screen readers for Windows computers as well, and those are just a program that you would install just like any other program that will read the screen to you. But the thing to note as someone who is publishing content or publishing an app, for example, if you don't take certain steps to ensure that the information in your app is available to people with disabilities, then your app isn't really going to work for you. For example, just as a simple example, a lot of times, apps will use icons. That's a very common thing, especially on mobile apps, because there's not very much screen real estate, and so you really have to try to cram as much information in there as possible. And so one way we do that is by providing icons, so maybe a left-pointing arrow for a back button. Well, if that hasn't been handled properly in the code, then the screen reader might not know how to handle that. So it may say button, it may say left arrow button, whereas what it should say, and if it's programmed correctly, it will say back button, so that the user knows that that's something that they can click on or double tap on. So that's just one example of things that need to be thought about on when creating the apps themselves and in their coding and design.
So that kind of leads into our next question. What are some of the pitfalls or avoidable difficulties that organizations often encounter in the pursuit of accessibility? So I imagine that there'll be kind of two different perspectives here. One from your perspective as a user of the accessibility, as well as the coding, and then Ryan's experience as a coder as well. So can we get, what are some of those kind of basic, like you talked about saying left arrow button instead of back button? What are some of those what are some of those pitfalls or areas that are fairly common but easily avoidable?
So I think there's little specifics like that, right? Like when you go to label a button for a screen reader user, do you tell the user what it looks like? A green square with a check mark or something like that. For somebody such as myself who's never seen anything for submit or whatever makes sense there.
Could you maybe just repeat that last sentence? You just got frozen for a minute.
Oh, yeah, sorry about that. So basically what I was saying was that, that iconography doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. And so maybe a much better, much more informative label for a button would be confirm or, or continue or accept or whatever the particular button makes sense, whatever the particular label is that makes sense in that context. As far as pitfalls that I often see folks falling into, and let me know if you are unable to hear me. One big thing is the use of scanning tools for websites. So there is a class of software out there that purports to be able to tell you whether or not your website's accessible. And the problem with that is that whether or not something is accessible, fundamentally, that is a question of the user interface. You're basically, when you use software like a scanning tool, you're asking it to tell you, is this usable by humans? So you're asking a computer program to tell you, is this something that people can use? And we're not there yet. Maybe someday we will be with AI, but at this point, a computer really can't tell you, okay, yes, this this website is accessible, or on the contrary, this website is inaccessible. Now, that's not to say that those scanning tools can't be helpful. They can help you recognize situations where you might have missed labeling an element, or maybe you didn't give a graphic a label, but that graphic is important and needs to have a label. So that's one pitfall that I often see folks falling into, is just using the scanning tool. Really, accessibility ultimately comes down to a question of, can an actual user use this? And the only person who can accurately answer that question is, in fact, a human user. So I think human testing and user testing is a very important part of accessibility and ensuring that you have good accessibility.
Ryan, do you have something to add in this area from your perspective?
Yeah, I had two kind of thoughts about it. So one of the things that I've found when trying to kind of build accessible sites is we rely on a lot of new technologies, such as the React framework, and doing a lot of JavaScript. Single page applications is maybe kind of the overall term for what we're doing. And because those are kind of on the one side, they're focused a lot on the UI, like the visual UI. So a lot of times they don't take into account accessibility and different ways of navigating a site, like using a screen reader or just using the keyboard. Older ways of making websites rely a lot more on HTML, which has a lot of built-in accessibility in it. And since we're kind of moving away from that into JavaScript land, there's kind of engineers have to be more aware of it, because there are certain things they're not getting out of the box. So that's a pitfall that I found a lot. And then another thing that what Aaron was mentioning actually made me think of is that a lot of times when user experience designers come up with how functionality in a page should work, if they don't consider accessibility and how screen readers or keyboard users would be navigating the page, a lot of times trying to put accessibility in after the fact isn't very successful, because for instance, in curriculum management, there are some of the pieces that were built kind of visually, and when we kind of after the fact come in and try to make that accessible for a screen reader, we kind of run into a lot of problems with that. So I think it's really important when you've got a visual or a UX designer working on something, that they understand accessibility and they understand and they consider how to make a feature accessible for screen readers and keyboard users.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, like any feature, when you have a requirement that's handled up front, you're also going to save yourself a significant amount of energy and money when you can consider that up front. It's really hard to bolt on. It can certainly be done. People do it all the time, but it can be really hard to bolt on accessibility, because it can potentially touch almost every part of your user interface. It's not just limited to a small subset of your surface area. So yeah, completely agree. It's it can be a challenge. One thing I do like about React personally is that although you do have to think about it, and the developers do need to be more aware of it, it's also an extremely flexible framework, as are many of the more modern frameworks. And so if your developers are aware of accessibility and are cognizant of the things that go into building an app, they can certainly be made accessible and very accessible using these modern frameworks. So you may not get it out of the box as much as you did when you were just building straight HTML sites, but it's at least achievable.
So in kind of piggybacking off of that, asking UX designers and developers to be considering this, to be considering accessibility early on kind of on the front end of development. How would you say that's, is that separate training? How are they getting that? How are they making those considerations, I guess? Where are they getting that knowledge from? And kind of what's the trend in that, if that's making sense?
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. So I think it is something that does need to be trained for. The unfortunate reality is that accessibility, although it's certainly got, it's been receiving a lot of attention. I guess it depends on your perspective. It's kind of hard for me to say that because I've been, doing accessibility for over a decade. So it's kind of hard for me to judge. But it really, in spite of all the attention that it is currently getting, we haven't really managed to close the loop between what needs to happen with accessibility, where we need to be at as people who develop websites, and the training that we're giving to our new developers especially. So while some of the new training courses and boot camps are starting to touch on accessibility a little bit here and there, as far as I know, there's really not a good solid course for average web developers that includes accessibility as a major component. Now, I'm hoping I'm wrong about that, and I very well could be, because it's not, new developer training is not my area of expertise, but the vast majority of them do not have an accessibility component, and that's really been a struggle, because things that you might there's a lot of bad assumptions out there, and unfortunately there's a lot of bad information out there. I mean, if you go and Google, okay, what's a way to make a good autocomplete, you're going to struggle to find one that's actually functional. Even even unfortunately, sometimes the ones from the organizations that you can usually really trust, like the W3C, don't always work. Now, many of them do. They're probably the best source of accessible components, but it's a struggle to find things that that actually are functional for accessibility, that do, in fact, do what they say, which is a really unusual situation. And I think the problem with that is that developers, for whatever reason, don't seem terribly comfortable with using screen readers. And so if you can't get in there and test your code and understand, okay, what's working, what isn't, you're really at a disadvantage. And I think if you try to just make something accessible by reading the various standards that are out there, for example, ARIA and so forth, you're really going to struggle to put that into practical application. So I think definitely being trained by a reputable source is really key. And there's definitely some great trainings out there, but it's if organizations don't invest in that training, the developers themselves are probably not going to come with it.
Ryan?
Yeah, I think, speaking as an engineer who kind of had to learn how accessibility worked, I think one of the things that's been the most helpful to me, like Aaron mentioned, is actually learning how screen readers work and learning it from the other end. For me, it's all about kind of trying to understand what the other person is, how the other person is kind of experiencing the page, and kind of trying to kind of basically be empathetic in terms of the use of that page. Having that understanding of how the screen reader works, I think is really essential, and kind of one of the first things that I feel like any engineer should try to learn. After that, reading the ARIA standard that Aaron mentioned with the W3C, it makes a lot more sense. Like when you read it before you understand how a screen reader works, a lot of times it's like a checklist, and it doesn't always, what you put doesn't always make sense or work correctly. But once you kind of understand a screen reader, then you actually can see what's missing, can use the ARIA standard to fix it, and then see that it's working, which is kind of a better feedback loop. Another thing with kind of trends, I've noticed that the React framework that we use, and that's fairly popular today, there's kind of a trend towards more and more extensions for that framework that are being released that have accessibility in mind. And I think that is really cool, because that kind of helps developers as they're developing things. It takes care of certain ways to build things. So it makes it a lot easier to make sure that sites are accessible. So that's a trend that I've been noticing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and I don't want to shortchange other types of disabilities. We're certainly, it's not just about making your site accessible to screen reader users. There's folks who are colorblind. There are folks who have, are restricted to only using a keyboard. But we tend to, at least in the accessibility field, tend to dwell a little bit more on screen readers, simply because that tends to be the elephant in the room. That's the one technology that really tends to cause the most issues for developers, for the reasons that we've discussed, because it's a lot easier to understand, tabbing through a site, can I access all of the things I need to with my keyboard? That's fairly, once you've taught somebody that, that's fairly understandable, but using a screen reader is a fairly different experience.
We have a couple of questions that have come in from. I'll just go through them. They're kind of one's a little more specific, one's a little more general. From your perspective, how has the world of technology changed over time to become more inclusive? Have you noticed that you've, I guess, has it accelerated at all lately, or is it kind of that slow? We kind of touched on it a little bit, but if you could maybe touch on that again,
yeah.
As far as overall technology.
Sure. I think the awareness has certainly grown, and as much as I dislike them and strongly feel that in the long run they are ultimately going to prove to be very bad for accessibility in general, all of the demand letters and lawsuits that are happening for small businesses, and various attorneys, sort of seeing that as the latest get rich quick opportunity, that has in fact brought more awareness. So there's more companies talking about it. They're probably not talking about it quite in the ways that an accessibility advocate would perhaps appreciate necessarily, but nevertheless, it is being talked about. I think we continue to iterate on technologies. I think things have gotten more accessible over time, but it's very slow. It's easy to miss if you're not paying really close attention, and even sometimes I struggle to really see the differences because they are so incremental. But fortunately, thanks to folks continuing to companies continuing and organizations continuing to think about accessibility, I think we're not losing ground. We're slowly gaining ground, but it is it's a long process. It's a lot of work to get us there, and it's not a sure thing. So it's definitely something that we have to keep pushing for and working towards for equal access.
what are some of your suggestions for how companies or institutions can make accessibility a priority for them?
Well, what I will say that more on a nuts and bolts type approach is when I was at Instructure, the accessibility team, which I led, was ultimately given the authority to block a release if it wasn't accessible. And that sounds harsh. It wasn't so much blocking a release. Actually, we were able to block features, and that, I think, you really have to decide: are you going to is accessibility or the lack thereof something that you need to work on as a feature, or is it a bug? And if it's a bug, if you can acknowledge as a company or organization that it's a bug, then how serious is that bug? Is it a stop the world bug, or is it something we can live with for a little while? And really, that ultimately, putting somebody in your company, getting a single person or organization or whatever needs to happen of folks whose job it is to ensure accessibility. Maybe they can have other roles, but making them the accessibility coordinator, designating somebody in that role, and then giving them the authority to actually make those, to be able to push back when features are being released. I think it's really just about prioritization. How seriously are you going to take this as a company or organization? And then making it stick, making the policy changes. There's certainly a lot to be said for the grassroots approach to accessibility, and a lot of companies have gotten pretty far. But if it doesn't come down from the top as a mandate, there's often the risk that because timelines are always crunched, timelines are always going to be tight, products are always going to be late. And when that happens, inevitably accessibility gets pushed to the end of the line, unless it's been made a priority.
Thank you. Ryan, really quickly, do you have anything to add on that end from your perspective?
I don't know if Aaron would agree with this, but I feel like having either a very strong advocate or a dedicated person or team at your company that really understands accessibility, I think helps a lot. When I was at Expedia, we had an accessibility team that we could go to if we had any questions. They would audit things, and that resource was just incredibly valuable. So I think if you can have something like that, and Aaron has been that for our team, I think that makes all the difference.
Perfect.
Yeah, absolutely. Just making sure that don't just keep it. So what some folks will do, and I'll be quick here. What some companies will do is they will hire a consultant, but they won't actually give that person access, or more appropriately, they won't give their development team access to that person. And so when a question comes up, they basically has to be filtered up the chain. And the more you can shorten the path between your developers have an accessibility question and they need to get an answer, the better off you're going to be. Let the people who are working on that have access to that resource.
That's wonderful. Any kind of last thoughts before we wrap it up? Okay.
Yeah. Otherwise, I mean, folks are welcome to reach out if they have further questions or whatever.
Perfect. Aaron and Ryan, thank you so much for participating in today's webinar. Again, we've recorded this. We'll send a link out to everyone, including our panelists if they'd like to utilize that. And we hope everybody has a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.